On September 27, 2025, an urgent telegram from Tel Aviv was placed on the desk of the interim president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. The sender was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with a chilling ultimatum: 72 hours to choose, either submit or face a coup. The question that shook all of Africa was, why did Netanyahu dare to be so arrogant? Who truly stands behind this ultimatum, and how will I truly respond? Hit like and join us as we uncover the next dramatic developments. The ultimatum delivered to Burkina Faso was not a vague suggestion. It was precise, cold, and absolute. 5 demands written in clear terms, each one targeting the very foundations of the young nation's sovereignty. First, Israel demanded the full restoration of mining contracts. Burkina Faso is Africa's 4th largest gold producer, with over 115 metric tons mined in 2022, yet much of that wealth has historically flowed out of the country. The ultimatum called for gold, uranium, and manganese to be handed back to Israeli corporations locked into 25-year agreements that would strip away local control for a generation. Second, the letter demanded the reinstallation of surveillance and intelligence systems. Since 2022, Ibrahim Traoré had expelled French troops and curtailed Western nodes. Israel wanted to reverse this, re-establishing satellite stations, telecommunications hubs, and military advisors inside Ouagadougou. Third, the demand was economic. Traoré had promised to break from the CFA franc, a currency tied to Paris, in favor of a new West African alternative with Mali and Niger. Israel insisted on the opposite, a return to transactions in United States dollars and Israeli shekels. Fourth, the ultimatum targeted international partnerships. Burkina Faso had purchased helicopters and radar systems from Russia in 2023. China was building 5 networks in Ouagadougou. Iran had pledged scholarships and renewable energy cooperation. Netanyahu's government demanded all such ties be severed. Finally, the most severe demand was the transfer of power. The ultimatum proposed a transitional council approved by Western allies, effectively forcing Traoré to resign. The message was blunt: comply or face coup d'etat within 72 hours. This was not simply a bilateral dispute. Behind Netanyahu's message loomed a larger shadow: the machinery of global interest, from mining giants to intelligence agencies from Washington to Paris. For Burkina Faso, the clock was ticking. But this was only the surface of a deeper storm, because the real battle would be fought not on paper. Ibrahim Traoré did not hesitate. Within hours of receiving the ultimatum, he stood before his people and the world, responding point by point with words that cut like steel. On the matter of resources, he declared, Burkina Faso extracts more than 2 million ounces of gold every year, representing 80% of our exports. But for decades, 70% of that profit left our soil for foreign shareholders. I would rather see my people endure poverty for 1 generation than sell our sovereignty for a quick fortune. His statement echoed through every corner of Ouagadougou, striking a chord with citizens who had grown weary of foreign companies enriching themselves at the expense of local communities. On surveillance and intelligence, Traoré invoked history. In 1961, Patrice Lumumba of Congo was murdered after refusing to submit to Western interests. His killers acted under the banner of foreign intelligence. Ouagadougou will not repeat that fate. No foreign agency will watch every breath of our people. The comparison was stark, a warning that Burkina Faso would not allow itself to become another casualty of global manipulation. Economically, Traoré attacked the heart of the ultimatum. For nearly a century, the CFA franc controlled from Paris has shackled our economy. When anger dared to challenge Paris, they cut off electricity, they cut off aid. But we are not afraid. We will create our own destiny with our brothers in Mali and Niger. The crowd listening erupted with cheers, sensing the magnitude of what he was promising. On international relations, he did not waver. Former President Donald Trump once withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, leaving the Middle East in chaos. That decision was imposed on the world without respect for those who suffered. Burkina Faso will not bow to such dictates. We will choose our own partners, whether in Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran. And finally, his closing words struck like thunder: Burkina Faso will not become the new colony of any empire. If I fall, there will be millions who rise. It was no longer just a diplomatic quarrel. In that moment, Traoré transformed the ultimatum into a battle cry for African sovereignty, igniting a flame his adversaries had not anticipated. As Traoré's words echoed across the land, the very air in Burkina Faso seemed to vibrate with unease. By the 24th hour, Ouagadougou's streets had transformed into a living battlefield of voices. Crowds surged through the avenues, some waving the national flag high, chanting his name like a hymn of defiance. Others gathering in tense clusters, demanding order, warning that his defiance risked plunging the nation into chaos. The ultimatum had achieved its hidden aim: to fracture a people against themselves. Within the barracks, unity began to splinter. High-ranking officers whispered doubts, questioning whether Traoré's defiance would invite calamity from powers far greater than their own. Rumors of a coup spread like wildfire through the ranks. Yet among younger soldiers, there was no hesitation. These were men and women who had watched their parents, sweat and land sold off through foreign contracts. To them, Traoré was not just a commander, but the answer to generations of silent prayers. The markets felt the tremor as well. Gold prices whipped violently, rising and crashing with every rumor from Ouagadougou. In London and New York, traders speculated as though the nation itself were a stock to be gambled on. But in the streets of Burkina Faso, families watched the cost of bread and fuel climb by the hour. What the world called politics had already become their daily struggle for survival. Global media sharpened the divide. Western outlets painted Traoré as a reckless officer, too young and too bold, willing to gamble with his people's future. Yet across Africa, his image burned like a beacon. In Mali and Niger, entire radio stations broadcast his speeches word for word, urging their citizens to see Burkina Faso stand as their own. On social media, the war of narratives raged, truth, lies, and propaganda colliding in real time, reshaping perception with every passing hour. Through the storm, Traoré's voice remained steady. "This is not about me," he declared on the second day to a sea of supporters. "It is about whether Burkina Faso belongs to its people or is auctioned off to the highest bidder." His words were both defiance and prophecy, sketching the battlefield between sovereignty and subjugation. And so the 72-hour countdown ticked on, not as mere numbers on a clock, but as thunder gathering on the horizon. It was no longer only Burkina Faso's fate at stake, but the balance of power across an entire continent. By the second day, between the 24th and the 48th hour, the ultimatum's shadow grew heavier over Burkina Faso. Tension no longer lived only in government offices or military barracks. It had spilled into the daily lives of ordinary people. An assassination attempt rattled the capital. According to local reports, an identified gunman targeted a convoy believed to be carrying senior officials close to Traoré. The attack failed, but the message was clear. The pressure was no longer confined to diplomacy. Fear swept through Ouagadougou, where citizens whispered of invisible hands orchestrating chaos from abroad. For the people in the markets, fear was matched by hardship. Basic goods became scarce, with merchants hoarding rice and flour expecting further unrest. Fuel prices doubled within 48 hours. Families who once lived days suddenly faced impossible choices: buy food or save for medicine, walk miles instead of paying for transport. Social order began to fray. Waves of misinformation flooded social media.
Some posts declared that Traoré had already been killed. Others claimed that foreign troops were on their way. Panic spread quickly in villages with little access to reliable news. Yet at the same time, countless Burkinabés refused to surrender to despair. They organized neighborhood patrols, protected local shops, and carried signs reading, "Sovereignty has no price." For Traoré's government, the internal divisions deepened. Some ministers urged negotiation, fearing civil war. Others rallied behind their leader, believing any concession would mark the end of true independence. In this divided climate, one truth became clear. The ultimatum had succeeded in pushing Burkina Faso into a crucible of survival. And through this crucible, the world began to see something striking. An entire society caught between fear and defiance, forced to decide whether it would endure or collapse. As the clock pushed beyond the 48th hour, Burkina Faso entered the most perilous stage of the ultimatum. In Ouagadougou, thousands of citizens poured into the streets. Some marched with banners bearing Traoré's face, chanting for freedom and unity. Others, encouraged by whispers of foreign support, carried placards demanding that order be restored. The capital became a theater of confrontation where loyalties collided in public view. At the same time, a faction of military officers stepped forward, declaring that they would reclaim stability. Their announcement, broadcast on local radio, sent shockwaves through the country. Was this the coup foreshadowed in Netanyahu's ultimatum? Or was it a bluff meant to test Traoré's resilience? Despite the turmoil, ordinary citizens displayed a courage rarely seen in moments of national crisis. Women led processions to the central square, singing traditional songs of resistance. Religious leaders called for peace, but also affirmed the right of the nation to remain sovereign. University students organized late-night gatherings debating whether their future lay under the banner of independence or in the shadow of foreign power. The international community watched closely. In Bamako, Niamey and Era sympathetic voices rose, praising Traoré's defiance. Yet in Western capitals, editorials warned of instability spreading across West Africa. For many Burkinabé, the events of these final 24 hours felt like living inside a storm of history. Fear lingered in every corner, but so did determination. Families prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Rumors of compromise circulated, yet no one truly knew what dawn on the 72nd hour would bring. Burkina Faso was now standing on the edge not only of political upheaval but of a transformation that could redefine its place in Africa. The ultimatum had forced the nation into a test of will, and every heartbeat of its people became part of that struggle.
While the people of Burkina Faso counted down the final hours, the rest of the world analyzed every development with intense scrutiny. In Washington, the ultimatum raised questions far beyond West Africa. For some in the United States intelligence community, Netanyahu's letter looked less like an isolated demand and more like a coordinated play, one in which America's own interests could not be disentangled. Analysts on Cap Hill debated in closed sessions. Should the United States remain silent, or should it take a stand? Publicly, American officials said little. Privately, however, think tanks and policy advisors were buzzing with concern. The minerals at stake, gold, uranium, and manganese, are critical not only for Africa, but for global markets, from nuclear energy to modern electronics. If Burkina Faso defied the ultimatum and succeeded, it might inspire other African nations to reclaim their resources. To some in Washington, this was a scenario that could disrupt decades of economic arrangements. Meanwhile, the CIA was whispered about in African media as a shadow actor. References to past operations from Patrice Lumumba in the 1960s to covert interventions in the Middle East gave weight to the suspicion that United States agencies might not remain passive. American commentators rejected such claims, but the perception itself mattered. In Africa, perception often carried more weight than policy statements. Israel, for its part, presented the ultimatum as a matter of national security. Officials in Tel Aviv framed it as a defensive action to safeguard Israel's strategic partnerships and resource lines. Yet few doubted that the tone of Netanyahu's demands was shaped by broader Western interests. At the same time, Moscow and Beijing closely monitored events. Russian media emphasized Burkina Faso's right to self-determination, framing Traoré as a hero of resistance. China highlighted its infrastructure projects in Africa, portraying itself as a partner who respected sovereignty. Trinta positioned itself as a friend to Ouagadougou, promising scholarships and renewable energy partnerships. The ultimatum had therefore become more than a political drama. It was a mirror reflecting the fault lines of global power. Across Africa, reactions to the ultimatum were not muted. They were passionate and unfiltered. In Mali and Niger, leaders publicly praised Ibrahim Traoré for rejecting what they called neo-colonial dictates. State broadcasters replayed his speeches, framing them as a new anthem for West African independence. Citizens gathered in public squares holding candles and chanting solidarity with Burkina Faso. The symbolism was powerful. If one nation stood firm, others might follow. The African Union expressed deep concern but avoided taking sides. Caught between its principles of sovereignty and its reliance on foreign aid, ECOWAS, the West African bloc struggled as well.
Torn between governments that feared instability and those who quietly admired Traoré's audacity. For many ordinary Africans, however, the choice was simple. Support the young leader who dared to speak what they had long felt. Western Europe reacted differently. Editorials in Paris warned that Burkina Faso risked isolating itself from the international community. British and German outlets echoed similar concerns, emphasizing market instability and potential migration pressures. Emmanuel Macron, already criticized for France's declining influence in the Sahel, found himself portrayed as a silent partner in the drama. Meanwhile, in African universities and cultural forums, the discourse took on a historic tone. Scholars compared Traoré's defiance to the independence movements of the 1960s, when leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara envisioned a continent free from external control. Social media hashtags spread rapidly. Hashtag Africa Awakens, hashtag Stand with Bakay and a hash Ibrahim Traoré. Each one amplified the sense that this was more than Burkina Faso's struggle. It was Africa's. Global investors to watch nervously. The possibility of a new African model of resource control threatened existing contracts across the continent. If Burkina Faso could successfully resist, mining companies from Johannesburg to Toronto would face emboldened governments renegotiating deals. By the end of the 72-hour countdown, it was clear the ultimatum was not just a confrontation between Israel and Burkina Faso. It had become a defining moment in the struggle between global systems of power and the rising voices of African sovereignty. As the final hours of the ultimatum approached, the world expected either collapse or capitulation. Yet, what unfolded shocked both allies and adversaries. Instead of retreating, Ibrahim Traoré unveiled a strategic move that altered the entire balance of power. On the morning of the 72nd hour, Traoré appeared not in the presidential palace but on the steps of Burkina Faso's National Assembly, flanked by community leaders, trade union representatives, and religious figures. He announced the creation of a National Sovereignty Council, a body composed of civil society, military representatives, and local chiefs. This council, he declared, would oversee the nation's resources and foreign contracts, placing them under the guardianship of the Burkina Faso people. The twist was devastating for his opponents. The ultimatum had demanded that Traoré step down in favor of a Western-approved transitional council. Instead, he preempted the demand by forming his own council rooted in national legitimacy and popular backing. The symbolism was unmistakable. He would not be forced out. He would expand the base of his authority. Crowds erupted in celebration. In the streets of Ouagadougou, chants of L'Autre ou la Mort, fatherland or death, reverberated. What foreign actors had intended as a moment of vulnerability became a demonstration of resilience across Africa. Commentators labeled it the Ouagadougou twist. Suddenly, Traoré was no longer just a president under siege. He was a symbol of how an African leader could turn external pressure into internal strength. The immediate consequences of Traoré's maneuver rippled outward with astonishing speed. Western governments caught off guard hesitated to respond. They had prepared for a coup, for instability, perhaps even for his downfall. But they had not prepared for a leader who could shift the rules of the game with such confidence. In Washington, some analysts called it a dangerous precedent, fearing that other African nations might adopt similar councils to resist foreign influence. In Paris, policymakers worried openly that the CFA franc itself, the cornerstone of France's leverage in West Africa, could soon unravel if Traoré's defiance inspired Mali, Niger, or even Senegal to follow suit. For Israel, the outcome was particularly bitter. The ultimatum designed to isolate Traoré had instead united large parts of Burkina Faso's population behind him. Netanyahu's demands now looked less like strategic diplomacy and more like overreach. International media, once skeptical of Traoré, began publishing headlines about the young captain who outplayed the global order. Most striking was the regional response. Leaders in Mali and Niger announced plans to form a joint economic bloc with Burkina Faso, fast-tracking the very monetary reform that Israel had tried to block. African intellectuals hailed Traoré's council as a 21st-century echo of the Pan-African dream once envisioned by Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara. The ultimatum had been meant to break him. Instead, it became the crucible that transformed Ibrahim Traoré into more than a head of state. He emerged as a symbol of Africa's refusal to bow, an emblem of sovereignty in an age when sovereignty seemed negotiable. As the dust of the 72 hours finally settled, one truth shone brighter than all others. Burkina Faso had not fallen. Against every prediction, against the weight of foreign powers, and against the pressure of an ultimatum designed to break its will, the nation had risen, not through weapons nor through wealth, but through conviction, unyielding, and bending, unbroken. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as nothing more than a young officer, untested and out of his depth, now stood as a symbol far greater than himself. He had endured the pressure of empires, the threats of corporations, and the whispers of betrayal from within. Yet in the end he emerged not only as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as the embodiment of an idea that Africa had long carried within its soul: the right to stand tall without permission from others. The streets of Ouagadougou told the story. Farmers who had once bent their backs in silence now lifted their heads high, speaking not just of planting crops but of sowing the seeds of independence for their children. In classrooms, students repeated his words to one another, turning lectures into forums of debate, transforming education into the training ground for sovereignty. The marketplaces, though battered by speculation and uncertainty, carried a new current of pride. Each transaction now carried with it the belief that dignity was not for sale. Across the continent, his defiance spread like fire carried by the wind. In Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry, young men and women gathered in cafes and open squares, their conversations laced with his phrases, their voices swelling with the memory of giants Sankara and Nkrumah Lumumba. Traoré's courage had reached beyond borders, tapping into an inheritance of struggle that no ultimatum could erase. International powers had sought to frame him as reckless, even dangerous, but the narrative slipped out of their hands. In African households, from villages under the Sahel sun to bustling cities along the Atlantic coast, Traoré's stand was seen not as the gamble of one man, but as the awakening of a continent. For too long, Africa had been told to accept its fate, to barter its future for short-term survival. Now a leader had dared to say no, and millions heard it as yes to their own dignity. Traoré himself gave the meaning to it all when he stood before his people and declared, "We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it." Those words did not echo as mere rhetoric. They rang as a declaration of war against resignation, against dependency, against the slow erosion of self-belief. In them was a call to the farmer tilling the dry earth, to the student opening a book by candlelight, to the mother who bore the weight of scarcity. Freedom was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It was a responsibility immediate and demanding that must be defended daily. The ultimatum, crafted with the precision of intimidation, had miscalculated its power. It sought to divide, to weaken, to remind Burkina Faso of its smallness. Instead, it had summoned forth a unity forged in hardship, a defiance born of memory, and a vision rooted in the soil of Africa itself. What was intended to fracture the nation had awakened it. What was designed to humiliate had instead inspired, and in that awakening lies a question far greater than Burkina Faso's borders. Do we stand with those who fight for their dignity, however fragile, however costly, or do we remain silent as history unfolds, as sovereignty is bartered away, as courage is punished?
The challenge is not only to Burkina Faso, but to each of us, whether we dare to recognize that the struggle for freedom in one corner of Africa is the struggle for freedom everywhere. The 72 hours will pass into history as more than just a deadline. They will be remembered as the moment when a nation was tested and chose not to bow, as the moment when a young officer defied the weight of the world, and in doing so gave voice to a continent's yearning, as the spark that reminded millions that sovereignty is not granted by decree, it is claimed by will. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré has touched your heart, then let this story not end here. Share it, carry it forward, speak it aloud, subscribe so that you may continue to walk this journey of an Africa that no longer bends its knee, that no longer sells its soul, that no longer waits for others to define its destiny. God bless Burkina Faso. God bless Africa. And may the courage of this moment remind us all freedom is not given. Freedom is taken and guarded fiercely by those who dare to believe.